I have, after the introductory keynote and the more general lecture opening up the theme of urban resilience, the general panel before lunch, now we move to the first slightly more discipline-specific panel called Resilience Through Landscape Planning and Ecosystem Design. We have a slight change in the program. Aziza Chawini couldn't come, unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, and she will be replaced by my colleague from Stuttgart, Professor Antje Stockmann. All I have to do is to introduce to you the chair of this session, Arno Schmidt, who is a very distinguished landscape architect in Germany. He was born in Munich and later on practiced in Stuttgart and Ulm, Leonberg and Ulm. And he has recently served as a chairman of the Federal Association of Landscape Architects, Bund Deutsche Landschaftsarchitekten, between 83 and 89, and as a president of the Federal Chamber of German Architects between 2004 and 2010. And we're very pleased that you could make it, and actually in the break I learned that it's the second time you visit Ein Shams. The first time was some point in the 80s, so I think on behalf of Ein Shams I will welcome you back and hand over the moderation of this next session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear students. It's a pleasure to be back here again. Actually, I think it's my fourth or fifth visit to Egypt, and as it was just said, I had the pleasure of giving a lecture at Ein Shams University years ago on the topic of landscape planning and environmental design and environmental protection. And at that time there was an effort actually to form a professional organization of landscape architects in Egypt. However, it did not come about, and perhaps it would be time again to try and do something like that, because I hear that both German University in Cairo and Ein Shams, as a matter of fact, are planning to introduce student courses in landscape architecture, and to quote an urban planner colleague of mine in Germany, well-renowned man, Thomas Sieverts. He recently said that he thinks the problems of urban development today can be better addressed by the tools or with the tools of landscape architecture and environmental design than by plain urban planning alone. So we are right here in the topic. I had prepared an opening statement that reflects more our relationship with nature as one factor in this balance that we are talking about. And I'm convinced that nature will survive on this planet Earth in one form or another, whether in the form of today is open, even if we humans should manage to terminate our own existence either through negligence, through an accident, or through willful action, such as an atomic war. The threat of that was greater 20 years ago than it is today, but still, it's not certain that we won't go the wrong way one way or another. Now, in this symposium, we are talking about resilience, and the flyer of the symposium here is actually describing resilience as the adaptive and learning capacity of urban subsystems. Now, originally, of course, the term resilience originated in the field of psychology, and it has been used in many different fields since. And of course, the term resilience also has been used to specify the staying power of nature itself, and that's why I gave the statement on nature. Nature is very resilient, and nature has gone through the evolution through millions of years, and is certainly to continue. It's not a stable form either, but it's a dynamic system and a dynamic existence at this very moment that we see. So I'm sure, as I said, resilience is used as to specify the staying powers of nature itself, and with it of the physical world and the natural processes, life as an ecosystem, and of course, as I said, one that is constantly developing itself further on. And this morning actually it was also said that urban subsystems, if we speak about resilience of these systems, it's not just threats and problems that come in from the outside. It's rather the case that these systems generate the problems themselves. So they come from inside, through the development and through the pressures that the system itself is putting on itself and on the natural landscape and on nature as a whole. Now, in environmental planning, the term carrying capacity had been used in former years, and that of course describes how much pressure the natural system and the natural environment can absorb before it suffers lasting damages and eventually breaks down altogether. Now, pressure in this sense may mean overuse by people, overuse by animals. Overgrazing is a big problem in certain areas of the world, or it might mean simply that too much pressure is put on the landscape and on the natural systems through input of toxic systems, toxic chemicals and other things. And of course also by plain overuse or mounting pressure with refuse and similar things. Now, sustainability was a term that originally used in forestry, meant not to take out more out of a living and ongoing system than is replaced by the system itself. Now, sustainability has long been talked about since the last 15 or 20 years, and it is a concept of not overburdening the environment and of using only up as much resources as we need without replenishing what is left for future generations. And of course this must be one thing that is of particular interest to the younger generations today. Of course you all probably know that in the big North-South dialogue on the political arena, the Brundtland report some years ago talked about this term of sustainability. Now, if we take that as quasi as a lead for our actions, then it's very, very difficult, and it puts a great responsibility on planning, because it is up to us then to try and find ways whereby the use of resources and the pressure that we exert on the environment is in such a way that conditions for future generations will not suffer. Now, urban planning today cannot be carried out successfully without considering landscape planning and environmental design and green infrastructure design as integral parts of its efforts. Now, the students of IUSD that are here today have spent 2 semesters, 1 year in Germany, so I take it that you have some insight into the things the way they are in Germany. Now, by law in Germany, landscape planning is a form of planning that is mandatory, and it does not only address the open landscape, but it specifically addresses also cities, towns, villages, all the built-up areas as well. Because you cannot look at open landscape to do landscape planning and environmental design without looking at the change between the built-up environment and the surrounding environment. And of course, all built-up areas, cities, towns, villages, they depend tremendously on their surroundings in every respect. In the supply of food, in the supply of energy, in the supply of goods, and even in the supply of fresh air and livable conditions. And of course, this is a relationship that works both ways. The city and the built-up environment also depends on the surrounding for disposal of refuse, for effluents, and for all these things. So you see that this is a very tightly interlocked thing that we have to deal with. Now, in large agglomerations and metropolitan urban areas, a functioning open space system that links the urban area with the landscape and creates a functioning network within the built-up area, incorporating such natural features as rivers, hills, and natural habitats, can and does contribute immensely to the quality of the urban fabric and therefore to the quality of life for people and quality of life in the city. Now here in Egypt and particularly in Cairo, I think this is particularly difficult because Cairo is settled in the very narrow Nile Valley and has a tremendous surrounding of open landscape, of course, but with very inhabitable features, and as we have learned this morning, even these areas do have their architectural history and they have their cultural values, but of course they are not quite the same as surrounding landscapes in many other areas. So I think problems here are even more difficult to address and certainly more difficult to solve. Now this morning we also heard about the challenge of climate change. And at a time when, as news in recent days have said, these reports tell us that the Arctic shield on the North Pole has never been as small as in September 2012. Ever since observations began, it should be clear to everyone, even if he runs for a Republican candidate for president in the United States, that climate change is actually a fact and not just a story. Climate change is real, and the consequences that we are certain to face in the near future, and that has been said this morning as well, is that natural disasters such as storms, flooding, drought, and similar things will occur more often and certainly be more severe than they have been before. Now this is a point that has to be addressed in urban planning as well. Now, with green infrastructure planning, will environmental planning and landscape planning be able to mitigate some of these problems? And I'm sure they can if they are addressed properly. Green infrastructure can improve climatic and social conditions by providing better air quality, filtering out dust, nanoparticles, providing space for people to assemble and to gather, and giving identity to places. On the other hand, we have heard this morning, and I fully endorse that, in an arid climate as we are here facing in the MENA area and in the MENA region, it cannot be the solution to create green structures and parks and gardens in the same way they are done in climate zones that have 700 or 900 millimeters of rain in a year. So we have to address the particular conditions that we face in the various areas and various regions if we want to come up with proper solutions. It's no way to go about if you use, as we heard this morning from the minister, that you use 2/3 of fresh water supplies for irrigating lawn, where lawn has actually no reason to be. But then on the other hand, this is a problem of our sense of beauty and our sense of naturality and our sense of what is fitting for our surroundings. And the problem of desert landscaping or zero graphic landscaping is evident, and it's been applied in other areas of the world where water consumption is just a big problem as it is here. But in any case, I'm quite certain that planning with nature, instead of planning against nature, can avoid conflicts and ease damages such as flooding and inundation, or the difficult situation in shorelines, as we have heard just in the last contribution before lunch break. And one of the pictures that I have seen there to me was not quite so impressive, because again it showed very obvious technical applications to shoreline protection, where there are other means of building up natural dunes and vegetation, even in very stark conditions as we are facing there. Now, one thing that I want to point out before we go into the contributions of the lectures today then, this afternoon is that all these things in my mind are necessarily linked to interdisciplinary planning. There is no doubt in my mind that really successful solutions for planning in urban settings today can only be achieved through interdisciplinary and concerted efforts of a whole group of experts. And that doesn't mean that one is doing his work and then turns over the material to the next discipline that is looking at it and adding up or taking away, but rather to discuss these things together at the same time from the very beginning, and forming expert groups that certainly have need of having a regional planner, a town or a city planner, an architect, a landscape architect, an environmentalist, certainly a traffic designer, and Cairo is a particular example for the difficulty of traffic design and mobility in cities, an infrastructure specialist, and I would also include a sociologist in order to arrive at what also has already been mentioned, not just top-down approach but also bottom-up approach, and I think it's becoming more and more important to practice this bottom-up approach as well. Now, one good example of such a concerted effort on a interdisciplinary approach to problem solving has been the International Building Exhibition IBA Park, and I have a book and a leaflet here that I'm happy to leave here with you if you want to have it. That was a 10-year effort from 1989 until 1999 in order to try and to revitalize a whole region in Germany. And the region is the Ruhr district, which is the old industrial, heavy industry and coal mining area in central northern Germany. Being in Stuttgart, you might not have visited that part of Germany. But the thing was that with the coal industry and iron industry, heavy metal industry declining, the whole region suffered various problems. Number one, high unemployment. Number two, an identity crisis. Number three, tremendous installations of technical nature, industrial installations that were not in use anymore. And on top of it, a tremendous amount of toxic waste, heaps of spoils from mining. The whole landscape was actually turned upside down. So the IBA Park called itself a workshop for the future of old industrial regions. And in 10 years, we tried to establish a different approach to things. And we tried to establish pride in those people that were unemployed in their relics of their industrial work. And we formed the term of industrial heritage sites, using old industrial sites for new uses and for a different approach altogether. And in the meantime, for instance, one of the mining towers in Essen has been named a UNESCO Cultural Heritage Site, because looking at these things has turned around, and these are actually cathedrals of industry. So it's a question of how we approach things that we find and how we deal with them. And in the meantime, I think the work that the IBA Park has done has been a guideline for planning around the world in approaching brownfields, and I'm quite sure that that is a theme here in the region as well. Now, in the statement on this symposium, it has also posed the question whether the MENA region can learn from Europe and vice versa, as a matter of fact. Now, to my way of thinking, there is no patent solution for these things, that you always have to look at the site first and at the place and at the region that you are addressing. You can gain from experiences, or you can profit from experiences that have been gained somewhere else, but you cannot take the solutions and put them to work one-to-one. For instance, in Germany, of course, climatic conditions are completely different than from what they are here in the MENA region and in Egypt in particular. And one thing that I want to point out particularly is that at the moment the highly developed industrial nations in Europe, Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, you name them, they all face a completely different demographic development from what you find in the MENA regions. Number one, our population is much older, and it's getting older and older because the birth rate is very low, and the population is not really growing anymore. It is stagnant, or it is even decreasing slowly and slightly. Only some metropolitan centers like Munich, Stuttgart, Hamburg are still growing, but a lot of cities in Germany are actually shrinking. And this is a completely different problem for planning again, because shrinking is something that we have no experience in. We are experiencing growth and have been experiencing growth. Now the MENA countries are younger countries and have a young population and a growing population with different dynamics. So I think this has to be looked at as well when we try to learn from one another. We try to learn from you in Egypt and in the MENA countries. Massa, for instance, the example has been named as an approach with zero energy use of a city in tropic or in arid climates. So these are tremendous experiences that have to be gained. In Germany, as I said, it's quite different, and for that reason, the contribution to the Venice architectural biennial that is currently underway in Venice is reduce, reuse, recycle. So that is an approach of trying to use less. That means CO2 emission and less building material and everything. Reuse it again, that means make structures that are existent, ready for new use. And recycle, if you cannot use it anymore, try to make sure to regain it again. And that is one thing I think that has to be addressed much more closely in the future as well when it comes to the water cycle. Normally we use water and we waste it. The minute it's run out of the tap and into the sink, it is wastewater. But I'm sure there are ways of regaining water, we call it in Germany grey water, for reuse again, for irrigation, for instance. In other words, try to catch and keep what there is without wasting what you have and put it to a proper use. And these are some themes I think that is also an important topic for the symposium that we are addressing today. Now I have used up my 20 minutes. The theme here says that there is discussion right afterwards, and I open the floor and ask if you have questions to what I have said before I introduce the two contributors for this afternoon that will show practical examples then of what I have tried to put to words right here. Are there any comments or criticism or questions on the floor? It's a bit difficult to look into the light because we don't see too well. If that's not the case, then we will continue with the two speakers of the afternoon, of the second session. And it's my pleasure as the first contributor to introduce Dr. Hen Faou, an architect and urban planner. Dr. Faou is a senior researcher and a PhD architect at Housing and Building National Research Center in Cairo University, and at the same time a PhD in sustainable built environment and urban development. She has more than 12 years of professional experience in sustainable design and planning, and before she has specialized in transdisciplinary research in national and international projects, and in particular on bioclimatic architecture in the Mediterranean Manual. Green pyramid rating system and green building codes are publications that she has contributed to. Dr. Faou authored and co-authored many peer-reviewed scientific papers and contributed in diverse conferences and workshops all over the world. And we have the pleasure of having Dr. Faou. It's your turn.
Thank you.